Somewhere inside a mountain in northern Thailand, 12 boys sat in total darkness and tried to breathe. They had no food. The flashlight was dead. The water that had trapped them was still out there, cold, black, and rising. No one above ground knew if they were alive. That was day 3. They would be inside for 17. The story of how they survived begins not with a dramatic rescue, but with a quiet choice made by a 25-year-old coach sitting on cold stone in the dark, with nothing left to give except one simple instruction: be still, breathe, we are together. It was June 23, 2018. The Mupa, the Wild Boars, were a youth football team from Chiang Rai, a province in the mountains of northern Thailand. They were a close group, energetic, loud. They trained hard, and they played hard. After practice that afternoon, several of the boys suggested a visit to Tham Luang Nang Non, a long cave system carved into the hills nearby. It was something local kids did, a small adventure. They had been inside before. Coach Ek agreed. He was 25 years old, more older brother than authority figure, and he cared deeply about his team. They left their bicycles and football shoes at the cave entrance and walked in. They were not planning to be long. The cave was impressive in the way that deep places always are. The walls were pale and rough, shaped over thousands of years by water and time. The boys' voices bounced off the stone. Some of them took photos. They walked further in. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, deeper still. Then one of the boys noticed something. The mud on the walls was streaked high, much higher than their heads, the kind of waterline left behind when a cave floods. Before anyone could say a word, they heard it, a low roar, growing louder, and then the water hit. The monsoon had arrived early that year, and harder than anyone expected. Rain was already hammering the hills above the cave. Water poured into the mountain through cracks and channels and came rushing through Tham Luang with terrifying speed. The boys ran. They slipped on the wet stone, grabbed each other, kept moving. Coach Ek pushed them forward, always forward, because going back was no longer possible. The water was already waist-deep behind them and rising fast. Coach Ek pushed them forward, always forward, because going back was no longer possible. The water was already waist-deep behind them and rising fast. After desperate minutes of running, they found it, a narrow elevated shelf of rock deep inside the cave, a place that would later be named Pattaya Beach. It sat just high enough above the water line. The flood stopped rising inches below their feet. They were safe, for now. But they were also 4 kilometers inside the mountain, sealed in by a wall of black water, with no food, no dry clothes, no phone signal, and one small flashlight with a battery that was already dying. The cave went silent except for the steady drip of water from the ceiling. That first night was the hardest thing most of them had ever lived through. When the flashlight finally gave out, the darkness was total. Not the kind of darkness you find in a room with the lights off. This was a darkness so complete it felt solid, like it had weight. The boys could not see their own hands in front of their faces. Some of them cried quietly. Some pressed close together for warmth. The youngest were just 11 years old, a long way from home, sitting on cold stone in absolute dark. Coach Ek sat with them and he listened. He listened to their breathing, their fear, the small sounds of boys trying very hard not to fall apart. Before he became a football coach, Ekapol Chanthawong had spent nearly a decade as a Buddhist monk. He had been ordained as a boy, an orphan raised partly by the monastery. He had spent years learning how to sit still, how to breathe, how to let fear pass through him without letting it take over. He had never imagined he would need those lessons in a place like this. But here, in the dark, with 12 boys looking to him for a reason to stay calm, everything he had learned came forward. He gathered the boys close. He told them to sit. He told them to breathe, slowly, deeply, in through the nose, out through the mouth. He told them that moving would burn energy they did not have, that panic would use oxygen they could not afford to waste, that their one job, their only job, was to stay still and stay together. He was not telling them everything would be fine. He didn't know that. He was telling them what they could control. And in the dark, the boys began to breathe. The days passed without shape. There was no sunrise, no sunset, only the cave, the cold, the sound of dripping water. The boys grew weaker. Their stomachs cramped from hunger. Their lips cracked. They licked moisture from the cave walls to stay hydrated. They slept in shift, huddled together for warmth. Coach Ek watched over them. He gave his own share of water to the youngest boys. When they asked if he was hungry, he told them no. He was lying. He had stopped eating entirely, rationing whatever little they had for the boys. By the end, he had lost significant weight, more than any of them, but he kept the meditations going. Every day, every hour that felt too heavy to carry. Breathe. Be still. We are here. We are together. It was not hope in any grand sense. It was smaller than that. It was one breath at a time. Outside the cave, the world had already noticed they were missing. Families arrived at the entrance that same evening, June 23rd, and found the bikes, the cleats, the empty bags. Panic set in immediately. Thai authorities launched a search. Divers entered the cave and were turned back almost instantly. The water was black, moving fast, and visibility was zero. It was like trying to swim through mud. In the days that followed, the rescue operation grew into something the world had rarely seen. Divers came from Britain, Australia, the United States, and China. The Thai Navy SEALs set up a base at the cave entrance. Enormous pumps were brought in and run day and night, pulling millions of liters of water out of the mountain. But the water kept coming. The monsoon did not stop. 9 days passed. No contact, no sign. The question no one wanted to ask out loud was already being asked in private. Were they still alive? Wide night exterior of the mountain. Rescue camp lights tiny below it. Heavy rain sealed cave entrance. On July 2nd, British cave divers John Valanthan and Rick Stanton pushed through the deepest flooded section of the cave. It had taken multiple attempts over multiple days to reach this point. The water was cold, the passages narrow, and the visibility was almost nothing. They surfaced in a dark chamber on the other side. Valanthan switched on his light, called out into the black. Silence. Then, voices. Thin, tired voice echoing off the stone. Valanthan asked, "How many of you?" A boy answered, 13. They had been inside the mountain for 9 days. They were weak and pale and thin, but they were alive, all 13 of them, sitting together in the dark exactly as Coach Ek had taught them. Still, breathing, together. One of the boys looked at the diver and said quietly, "We are hungry. Can we have some food?" Finding them was not the end. It was, in many ways, the beginning of the hardest part. Extracting 13 people, including 12 children who could not dive, through kilometers of flooded, narrow cave passages, was a problem that had no clear solution. The water was still too high, the tunnels were too tight, and the boys were too weak to swim even if the water had been calm. Rescuers brought food, medicine, and lights. They tried to keep the boys stable, but the clock was ticking. The monsoon would intensify again, threatening to flood the cave even deeper. Then, on July 5th, the rescue camp fell silent for a different reason. Saman Kunan, a 38-year-old Thai Navy SEAL and former national triathlete, died while placing oxygen tanks along the underwater rescue route inside the cave. He was a volunteer. He had come because he felt he had to. His tank ran out in the narrow dark, and he did not make it back. He left behind a wife, a family, a country that mourned him. The operation did not pause, but every person involved carried his name from that moment forward. The plan that emerged was unlike anything attempted in rescue history. Dr. Richard Harris, an Australian anesthesiologist and experienced cave diver, proposed sedating each boy with ketamine, a powerful anesthetic, and guiding their unconscious bodies through the flooded passages with divers on either side. Each journey would take hours through near-zero visibility water, through tunnels barely wide enough to pass a human body. It had never been done before, not at this scale, not with children. Every expert involved understood that some of the boys might not survive the journey. They proceeded anyway. There was no other option. On July 8th, the water levels had dropped just enough. The window was open. The first group of 4 boys was sedated and carried into the water. Hours passed at the cave entrance with no news. Rescue workers paced. Families waited in the rain. And then, one by one, 4 boys were brought out alive. The camp erupted. People wept. People who had not slept in days laughed and held each other. On July 9th, 4 more boys were brought out. Then on July 10th, the final group. Coach Ek came last. He had gone in first. He insisted on leaving last. When Ekapol Chanthawong was carried out of Tham Luang on a stretcher, blinking in daylight for the first time in 17 days, thin and pale and exhausted, every person at the cave entrance knew what he had done inside that mountain. All 13 were taken to hospital. All 13 made a full recovery. In the weeks after, the boys returned to football. They spoke to journalists, smiled for cameras, and slowly rebuilt the ordinary rhythm of their lives. Several of them, along with Coach Ek, were granted Thai citizenship, recognition for young men who had until then lived on the margins of their own country. Coach Ek did not celebrate easily. He had led the boys into the cave. That fact lived with him. He accepted the praise people gave him quietly, without much comfort. But the boys he had guided through 17 days of darkness saw it differently. They had been terrified. They had been starving. They had sat in total black with no idea if anyone was coming. And through every hour of that, there had been a steady voice beside them, not promising rescue, not pretending to have answers, just asking them to breathe and stay still and stay together. What he had was a practice. A discipline learned in a quiet monastery long before any of them. The practice of choosing stillness when everything inside you is screaming to run. The practice of breathing when breathing is the only thing you can control. He made that choice in the first hour, and then he made it again and again for 17 days. Survival is rarely one dramatic act. It is rarely the moment the divers surface or the moment the lights come on. Most of survival happens in the hours before that, in the small, invisible choice to stay present, stay calm, and not give in to the dark. Coach Ek made that choice in a cave in Thailand in June 2018, and 12 boys are alive because of it.